Hello there. So, the last part of ecology is all about fertilizers and eutrophication. So, in this bit, we're basically going to find out what fertilizers are, where they're used, what type of fertilizers there are, and some of the problems with using artificial fertilizers in particular. So, the first bit is about the use of fertilizers. So, I'm sure you've all heard of fertilizers. The whole point of them is that they make plants grow bigger and possibly faster as well. But what do they actually contain? Most fertilizers will contain three main nutrients: calcium, magnesium, and nitrates. Now, some of them can also contain ammonia, but if we look at this, calcium is included in fertilizer because it helps plants make cell walls. So it makes sense if you want plants to grow bigger, they need to grow more cell walls, so you put calcium in it. They also need magnesium to make chlorophyll, and they need nitrates to make amino acids and proteins for growth. Sometimes, instead of nitrates, fertilizers will contain ammonia, which can then be converted to nitrates in the process of nitrification. Now, just a little introduction to some fertilizers. So, three types of natural fertilizers can be manure, which is basically cow poo or other animal poo. Slurry is urine and feces. And compost is dead plant material. Now, after that, we can actually have natural fertilizers and artificial fertilizers. And what you need to know is the advantages and disadvantages of each. So, natural fertilizers then are things like manure, slurry, and compost. The advantage is that it's less soluble, so less of it will leach away into water. So let's say, for example, you use your fertilizer when there's a lot of heavy rain. Because it's not very soluble, less of it is going to leak away into rivers and waterways and pollute them. And we'll talk about what can go wrong if that happens later on. As well as that, it improves the soil humus. And the humus, as we mentioned in the last part, was just the organic content of soil. Disadvantage of natural fertilizer though is it's difficult to store. I'm sure you've seen on farms and stuff, they have these big massive slurry stores, which takes up a lot of space in the farm, and it's actually very, very dangerous because it produces a lot of poisonous gases, and its composition can vary. So you don't actually know how much calcium, magnesium, or nitrates are in the natural fertilizer at any one time. And even if you test it, it can be very variable depending on the type of animals you're using or even their diet. So what some farmers will tend to use instead is artificial fertilizers. And what you'll notice here is that the disadvantages of natural fertilizers are pretty much corrected in the advantages of artificial fertilizers. So artificial fertilizers basically come in a little sack with little white pellets, and you simply just go and spread them on your field. So they're easier to store, they don't take up as much space. You know its mineral content, and as well as that, because you know its mineral content, you buy specific fertilizer for specific crops. So if you're growing carrots, you buy specific fertilizer which is going to help the carrots grow. It's also absorbed faster by plants because it's more soluble. Now that leads us to a disadvantage. Because it's more soluble than artificial fertilizer, it washes away easily. So you need to be really careful and really controlled about when and how you put it onto your grass or your crops. As well as that, it has to be purchased, whereas the natural fertilizer, if you had those animals, would have been free. Now moving on to the next little part, we said how fertilizer can damage waterways and kill fish. So somehow the fertilizer kills the fish, but it kills them indirectly. So how does it actually happen? Now it's got something to do with all this green stuff here around it, but that's not the actual fertilizer. That is a different organism called algae. Now in this section about water pollution, we need to basically answer these three questions. What causes it? How does it kill fish? and how can it be prevented? So this is a major cause of water pollution. What we can see here is a field. Now, what's happened is there's been lots and lots of rain, and the water has run off along this way and into a waterway. Now, say for example in this field there was a lot of artificial fertilizer being used. This artificial fertilizer is very soluble, so when there's heavy rainfall it runs off into the waterways, and that is known as leaching. So leaching is when it rains a lot, the fertilizer dissolves and runs off into waterways, and then it can lead to something like this being caused further downstream. So what causes the water pollution then? The farmers use fertilizers, it runs off into the water, it causes microscopic organisms to grow rapidly, and in that case the microscopic organisms are algae, and this type of water pollution is called eutrophication. So let's have a look at eutrophication then. This is basically it in real life. It happens all over the world, and in Northern Ireland you can get really heavy fines if you cause this type of pollution. Recently there's been lots of pretty hefty fines for this. Now, what better way to look at this than actually answering a question on it? So this is a mark scheme, and the question was describe the process of eutrophication. So here's what happens. The fertilizer runs off into waterways, for example rivers. This provides nutrients for algae, which is all that green stuff we saw. Algae is little microscopic organisms which can photosynthesize. Now, what happens is the algae grows really rapidly, and we get an algal bloom. So that is when there is an explosion in the algae population. But because they grow so fast, they use up all the nutrients, and there's not enough nutrients to support them. So the algae use up the nutrients, and as well as that, they block the light, so they stop all the plants photosynthesizing. So the algae die. The next thing is we've got all this dead organic matter because of all these dead algae. So the bacteria use up the oxygen in respiration. So there's no oxygen for the fish. So the fish can't respire and they die. Now, that seems like a complicated process, but this is what you've got to talk about. There's an algal bloom. So they get all the nutrients and their population grows. The algae die because they've used up all the minerals, or because they've blocked up all the light and can't photosynthesize. Decomposition takes place by the bacteria, which use up oxygen. So there's no oxygen for respiration, so the animals die. And that is the process of eutrophication. Now, it is actually possible to reduce eutrophication or reduce the chances of it. And that can be done in several ways. You're not allowed to use fertilizer on sloped ground near waterways. You are not allowed to use fertilizer during periods of heavy rain. And finally, you need to control the amount of fertilizer you use. So in other words, you don't just go out into your field and throw on tons of fertilizer, because that is likely then to get washed away and cause eutrophication. And as I said, and as I showed you, in Northern Ireland, there's really, really heavy fines for people who use fertilizer really carelessly. So the very final section of ecology then is human activity and biodiversity. So what we've talked about was global warming and eutrophication. Obviously both of those kill different organisms, so that decreases biodiversity. In certain woodlands, they want to avoid cutting them down too quickly, so they use different types of strategies to protect the biodiversity. So in certain woodlands like that, what they do is they only harvest a small number of trees at one time, so that protects the habitats for the organisms, and so it protects the biodiversity of the area. Second of all, if they chop down a tree, they replace them, which is known as reforestation, so it preserves the habitats. And if you cut down trees, you don't reharvest the new trees that you've planted until those trees have become quite large. And that is the end of ecology. Woohoo! Bosh!